Morning. This morning it feels special somehow today. I was praying because I wasn't meant to be working this morning, but situations happened which meant that I had to go and work first. And when I work on a Sunday, I have no real guarantee that I'm going to get back in time. So thank you to those who prayed. I was actually back before the service started, which is a miracle. Everything about the service this morning, Roger and Helen came to join me. Roger spoke, I did the worship, Helen did the prayers, and coincidentally, we all talked and prayed about the same things. Shocking. And I don't believe in coincidence. And my talk this morning is going to continue that theme of nothing being a coincidence. So here we go. So the book of Ruth. The events of Ruth took place around the time of the Judges, which Tim so eloquently talked about last week. And I just say I am so grateful that I got the book with 4 chapters. Sorry, Tim. It was a period of time when God's people cycled from disobedience to defeat to deliverance on 7 different occasions. And in that book it says, because everyone did what was right in his or her own eyes, in other words, they did what they liked, sin was rampant and people hardened their hearts against God. And as a result of that, there was a famine in Bethlehem. A man called it Elimelech. Didn't they have wonderful names in the Old Testament? What's wrong with Dave? Or anyway, Elimelech took his wife Naomi and their 2 sons, Kilian and Mahlon, to live in Moab, where Kilian and Mahlon married 2 ladies called Orpah and Ruth, who were Moabites. In Deuteronomy, it says, be careful, or you will be enticed to turn away and worship other gods and bow down to them. And then the Lord's anger will burn against you, and he will shut up the heavens so that it will not rain, and the ground will yield no produce, and you will soon perish from the good land the Lord is giving you. So Moab was not in famine, and so food was plentiful. The family would have journeyed. Can I have the next slide, please? Oh, there we are, just the first one. Thank you. They would have travelled from Bethlehem, I hope you can see that, up towards Jericho, and then down the other side of the Dead Sea, down to Moab, wherever they settled there. And it was probably a journey of about 100 miles, and it would have taken them about a week. So can you put the next one up as well now? That's just for context. That's what the area is today. So we're talking about everything that's happened overnight. This is all that sort of area. So very relevant. Moab was a land that had oppressed Israel, and so there was hostility between the 2 countries. Not much changes, sadly. And at that time, Moab was an enemy of Israel. The Moabites were the descendants of a man called Moab, who was the son of an incestuous relationship between Lot and one of his daughters. That came from Genesis chapter 19. And in Numbers we read that the Moabites led Israel into sexual immorality and pagan worship. Deuteronomy laid out some pretty strong words. No Ammonite or Moabite may enter the assembly of the Lord, not even in the 10th generation. Ruth came from the 11th generation and was therefore exempt from that ruling. So Elimelech is trying to flee the judgment of God on Israel and is actually disobeying doubly by going to live amongst the Moabites. So after a little while, Elimelech died, leaving his wife Naomi with her 2 sons and their wives. And then Mahlon and Chilion both died, leaving 3 widows. And the 2 daughters-in-law were childless. The women were very poor, as there were no men to look after them. To be a widow at that time was probably the worst possible thing. It almost always meant that she would be destitute unless a family member took her in, and she might be taken advantage of or ignored. Just as an aside, when I was thinking about this story, reading it through, I saw 1 or 2 similarities to my own situation and began to imagine what my life might have been like if I'd lived in those days. So I was married to Dave. We lived in the promised land, Devon, with our 2 sons and a daughter. Although food was plentiful, jobs were not, and we were very poor. And God gave us a vision and led us to move to a land far away, Shropshire, where jobs were more available. And some years later, Dave died, leaving me a widow with children. And had I lived in the time of Naomi, Dave had no brothers, but he had many, many uncles. And I could have ended up having to live in Slough. So, thankfully, I live in the 21st century and I'm neither penniless, destitute or homeless, and I'm able to look after myself. But it was interesting just sort of thinking about what I might have had to deal with if I'd lived back then in that area. So, back to our heroes. Naomi decided to return to Israel as she'd heard that the famine was over and food was abundant again. She decided that Orpah and Ruth should return to their own families. Orpah obeyed her, but Ruth was absolutely insistent that she stay. In fact, she said, oh, did I not put it back in? Oh, well, never mind. Ruth actually said to her in chapter 1, don't urge me to leave you or turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me. So the women, oh, it is there, well done. I'm not very good with PowerPoint, so I'm quite surprised I actually managed to put it there. The women travelled to Bethlehem, where Naomi changed her name to Mara, which means bitter. She'd left Bethlehem, married with 2 sons and 2 daughters-in-law, and was returning a childless, penniless widow. So it's no wonder that she felt bitter. But it's worth mentioning that even then she didn't reject God. So we get down to chapter 2. That's chapter 1, really. Chapter 2. In order to find food, Ruth went gleaning. Now, if you don't know what that means, it basically means it's someone goes and collects the leftover grains from the harvest. God has always made provision for the poor and destitute. Way back in the times of Leviticus, he said, when you reap the harvest of your land, do not reap to the very edges of your field or gather the gleanings of your harvest. Do not go over your vineyard a second time or pick up the grapes that have fallen. Leave them for the poor and the foreigner. Coincidentally, she chose to glean in a field owned by a man called Boaz. Boaz spotted Ruth and asked his workers who she was. The servant told him that she'd asked permission to glean, and he also told Boaz that she'd been working non-stop all day without resting. So Boaz went to see Ruth, and he told her to just glean in his field and to stay close to the female workers and to take a drink whenever she wanted to. Ruth was so grateful she fell prostrate even, to the ground, asking why he was showing her such favour. He answered that he'd heard how faithful she had been to her mother-in-law, and he wanted to reward her and bless her for that. And then he called her over to eat with him at mealtime. And he told his men to leave her alone, to ensure that they left plenty of grain for her. At the end of the day, apparently she had collected an ephah of barley. That's wishful thinking. I could do with some garlic. That is apparently around 21 kilos, or you're not far off a sack of potatoes. When Ruth told Naomi what had happened and where she'd worked, Naomi told her that Boaz happened to be one of their nearest relatives, and asked God to bless him abundantly. And then we get to chapter 3. When Naomi heard how kind Boaz had been, she started to plan. It was possible that as a close relation of Elimelech, Boaz could become the family redeemer. We put up the redeemer. Oh, there it is. So if a man died and left a widow with no sons, his nearest relative would be given the opportunity to buy his land and marry his widow so that she could have sons to carry on the deceased name. This relative would be obligated at his own expense to buy the property and give it back to the relative who'd sold it. If the nearest relative refused, then the next closest kin would take on the role of the redeemer. There was a catch, however. The family redeemer couldn't make the decision to redeem on his own. He had to actually be asked by the widow to be her redeemer. And we sang earlier in that lovely song, if you've been forgiven and if you've been redeemed, sing forever to the Lamb. So it all works together. If no one chose the widow, she would probably live in poverty, as I mentioned earlier, or slough, because the law also prevented her from inheriting from her husband, and all assets would go to the nearest male relative, which was why the gleaning law was made. So Naomi told Ruth to bathe and put on her best perfume and dress in her best clothes. And then, when Boaz laid down to rest after the threshing, Ruth was to go and uncover his feet and lie down, and Boaz would know what to do. This was the custom in those days. I can seriously imagine myself doing that, or expecting my daughter or daughter-in-law to do it. In the ceremonial act, Ruth is asking Boaz to give her shelter, to take her under his wing and to redeem her. To pull a portion of a kinsman's garment over her was the legal way back then of claiming protection and redemption. So basically she's proposing to him, even though it's not February the 29th. Boaz knew that there was a closer male relative to Naomi than him, so he had to sort that out before he could go ahead. But he gave Ruth lots of food, lots of barley, and sent her home before anyone knew she'd been there. He was a very honourable man, and he didn't want her to look bad. So, chapter 4. Boaz goes to the city gates and sits down to conduct some business. And he called 10 town leaders and asked them to be witnesses for him. The gate of the city was like a courthouse where transactions took place and where cases were heard. And this was also where you'd most likely run into someone you knew. Boaz started the negotiation. He told them that Naomi was selling Elimelech's land and that the closer relative could redeem if he wanted to. But he said that if that man didn't want it, that he, Boaz, would redeem it instead. The man quite liked the idea of owning more land, so he said, yep, that's fine, lovely. And Boaz said, well, of course that means that you then have to marry Ruth so that she can have more children and carry on the family name and keep the land in the family. And the other man said, yeah, that's going to complicate things for me. Yeah, all right, no, I can't. And he removed his sandal and gave it to Boaz. Sandals were the ordinary footwear of the time, but were also symbolic in the relationship between a widow and her legal guardian. Giving of a sandal was like a signed contract, especially in cases where land was in dispute. So Boaz said to the crowd, you're witnesses to the transaction. I now own the land and have acquired Ruth. Everyone agreed that they were witnesses and proclaimed a blessing on Boaz and Ruth's family, that they would be prosperous and they would bring forth new generations just as their ancestors had done. And so they were married, Ruth had a baby, and the women of the town prayed that the child would be famous. Could we go to the last slide? There we go. So the child was named Obed. Obed became the father of Jesse, who was the father of King David, who was 27 generations before Jesus. Forward planning or what? So, what can we take from the story of Ruth? It is, as much as anything, a perfect demonstration of how God plans and guides our lives. He is seen everywhere throughout this book, weaving his purposes through events and circumstances. He used a famine to bring a Jewish man and his family to Moab, where the sons marry Moabite women. Through the unexpected widowhood of both Naomi and Ruth, they end up back in the promised land. That's Israel, not Devon. Because they hear that the famine has ended. Naomi taught Ruth about God, and Ruth made that life-changing commitment. God orchestrated all of it in order to accomplish his purposes. Ruth didn't even know Boaz existed in chapter 1, and then we read that she happened to find herself in Boaz's field, the most eligible bachelor in Bethlehem, and by coincidence, the closest family relative, almost. It was no coincidence. God's invisible hand steered her to that particular field on that particular day at that exact time. And it's still the same today. God has his hand in every area of our lives. He knows the plans he has for us. And even when we can't see it or feel it, it's all working together for our good and his glory. The thing is, do we trust him to do it? Even when life looks grim, do we trust him that he has his hand on all of it and all of us? And Naomi went to Moab, goes to Moab with her husband and sons, leaving everything behind, continuing to walk with God even when her 2 sons married Moabites. She worshipped God when everyone else was worshipping the devil. She taught Ruth how to have a relationship with God. And then she had the courage to return to her land and then boldly told Ruth to make a marriage proposal to Boaz. She launched her matchmaking plan, but she also knew how to be patient and wait on the Lord. Ruth was a woman who was both loyal and industrious. She was hardworking. Her job was menial, perhaps even degrading, but she did it. Ruth shared her food with Naomi. She was respectful but bold, willing to take risks. She also gained a great reputation because Boaz heard all about her. He heard how hard she'd worked all through the days. Boaz was a man of integrity and was greatly respected. He was known for his kindness and he was good to his employees. He followed the law by making sure the poor were cared for, and he gave Ruth far more than she needed. He protected and provided for Ruth even before they got married, and he was a man of purity even when he had the opportunity not to be. He urged a relative to do what was right, even though he actually wanted Ruth all along. And in the end, each of them was rewarded for being the people that they were. Naomi is now cared for. She has a family again. She's got a grandson. Ruth gets married and has a son who is King David's ancestor and therefore making the family tree of Jesus. And Boaz gets married and has the joy. It's like a film, isn't it? Just as Ruth saw reality in Naomi's faith and wanted it for herself, maybe some of you are ready to receive the Redeemer into your life, but haven't quite made that leap yet. Ruth and Orpah are examples of choosing different paths. As Moabites, instead of living the way others lived, Ruth chose to follow God. Orpah started out following Naomi, but then bailed. God doesn't want a half-hearted commitment. Ruth clung to Naomi, and that gives us the idea of sticking to someone, and was used in the same way as a man cleaving to his wife. We read that she was determined to stay with Naomi until death. We all need a redeemer. Boaz did all the work to make redemption happen, while Ruth requested and received what had been accomplished on her behalf. The Bible says we need someone to rescue us from sin. If you think you can't possibly be forgiven for what you've done, that's not true. God can and does forgive us. He forgave a Moabite, and he can give us a fresh start too. And just as Ruth needed to ask for redemption, so we need to ask Jesus to redeem us. In the Old Testament, a redeemer must be related by blood. He must be able to redeem, and he must be willing. Jesus took on flesh and blood so that he could relate to us. He is able to redeem because he paid the price for our redemption, and he was more than willing. Are you willing to receive him as your Redeemer? The book of Ruth concludes with that genealogy all the way down to Jesus. God's perfect plan. 28 generations, 30-odd generations before, planned it all absolutely perfectly so that when the moment was right, Jesus would come into the world to be our Redeemer. Amen. Two services, the voice is gone.
Well done. Let's give Jen